My wife and I were stationed in Okinawa, Japan for 3 years, and we had Haley with us, our, at that time, 3-year-old. Okinawa, if you don't know, is a really tiny speck of coral just off the coast of Japan. It's 67 miles long, between 2 and 10 miles wide, so it's really, really small. We've been there about 3 months, and we had found a house in Ishikawa, a little fishing village that, of course, smell like fish. It was a real culture shock for us. And I'm sitting there at about 5:30 in the morning. I've gotten up, I've got my uniform on, I'm having my breakfast, when all of a sudden it started. The windows or the pictures on the wall began to shake back and forth in the kitchen. The pots and pans that were hung up began to clang together. And then I heard this high-pitched, ear-piercing sound that I thought at first was a siren, but it was my wife who was running down the hall screaming in that way that only women can scream. And we were terrified. It was an earthquake. And an earthquake on an island, you know, you're thinking, this thing's going down. You know, it's pretty much at sea level. There's no mountain or anything. I mean, we really were terrified. It was probably one of the most uncomfortable things. You're helpless. You feel like that nothing is in your control. An earthquake is no fun at all. I don't know how many of you have experienced a real earthquake, but it is really, really a terrifying thing when the very ground under your feet is shaking. But I've had another kind of shaking that I think was worse than that hurricane. In fact, this kind of shaking came when God spoke into my life. And when God spoke into my life, it was more terrifying, more unsettling, more earth-shattering, gut-wrenching. And I would just ask you, think back in your life to a time when God first spoke into your life. If I'm right, it turned your world upside down. It upended everything that you thought. When God speaks into our life, He shakes your world in a way that, I'm telling you, at least it's humbling. He shakes your world in a way that nothing really seems stable anymore. There's a Christian philosopher that I like. His name is Neil Postman, and he wrote one of my favorite books, is Amusing Ourselves to Death. In that book, he said this: I believe I am not mistaken in saying that Christianity is a demanding and a very serious religion, and when it's delivered as easy and amusing, it's another kind of religion altogether. In other words, this business of God is serious. It's earth-shattering. It jars everything in us. And the early church understood this. If you think back, Jesus shook their world like nothing before. Everything in those early believers' lives were turned upside down. Everything was shaken to its very core, because when God speaks into the world, when God speaks into a life, it shakes everything that can be shaken. These Jewish believers were, for the most part, converts from Judaism. These early Christian believers had to leave their faith, and not only was the Roman Empire after them, but their fellow Jews had turned on them, because in their mind, these Christians had abandoned the faith of Yahweh. And so they were facing persecution. Some had lost their homes. Some had been arrested. They were in prison. Their world was being shaken in a way that they never expected. And now, many of these early believers are right at this place where they're thinking about abandoning their faith and going back to Judaism. At least they would be safe then, right? So if they just gave up on this whole idea of Jesus and gave up on this grand adventure, then they could go back to a nice, normal, peaceful, settled life. And so in our reading, New Testament reading, the author of Hebrews, if you'll turn there, and And I say the author of Hebrews, we have no idea who wrote it. A lot of people think they know. And incidentally, if I say anything wrong, Ed will be correcting me in the fall when he teaches on Hebrews. That's his subject for fall Sunday school class. So the author is making an argument throughout this letter to these Jewish Christians, and his argument is simple. He's saying that this new covenant, Christianity, is superior to that old covenant, Judaism, and he begins to list the kind of ways that Christianity is far superior. And as he walks through it, he's saying that this old covenant, Judaism, was just a shadow or a foretype of the real thing of this new covenant, Christianity. And the temple that existed then was just a shadow or a copy, a foretype of the real temple in heaven. And the priests of Judaism were just a foretype or a shadow of the priest, the high priest, Jesus himself, a priest after the order of Melchizedek. The animal sacrifices in the old covenant were just a foretype or a shadow of this new sacrifice, which was Jesus himself. He was not only the priest, but he was the sacrifice that was offered once for all. In fact, the author writes these words, "For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, can sanctify to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall he, through the eternal Spirit offered himself, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God?" This old sacrificial system had to be done over and over. This new one is a once-for-all sacrifice, far superior. And now we come to chapter 12, and we pick up our lesson for today. And the author continues this argument as he describes in the Old Covenant how that very covenant itself was delivered to Moses. And if you remember the story, God gave the commandments to Moses, and he had to go up a mountain, and they had to cordon off this mountain, and it began to shake, and smoke and fire poured from it. And they cordoned it off because if even an animal touched the mountain, they would fall over dead. And Moses alone went up this mountain, and it was terrifying. The voice of God thundered. And the Bible says that even Moses trembled with fear. The author is saying that even Sinai, where the mountain shook, and the fire and the smoke and the voice of God trembled, that Sinai is nothing to be compared for the voice of God when he speaks into the lives of believers. Mount Sinai shook when the law was delivered, but now individual lives and nations and all of creation shakes under the voice of God. And here's the real punch from today's New Testament epistle reading. When God speaks into your life, he always shakes you at the very core of your being. He shakes everything that can be shaken, everything that's temporal, so that all that remains is what can no longer be shaken, that which is eternal. That's what the author is arguing. When God speaks, he shakes. Verse 26, at that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth but the heavens as well. You know, God never condescends to come down to speak to humanity, to speak into your heart. And if you're a follower of Jesus this morning, he came down and he spoke into your heart. God never comes down to speak just to pass the time of day. God's always got a purpose when he speaks into our lives. He always had this purpose. And if you think about it, his words, whenever he spoke into your life, rattled you. In the same way, if you look in the Old Testament, when God spoke to those Old Testament saints, he spoke to Abram and shook his world. He spoke to Isaac and shook his world. He spoke to Jacob. He spoke to Joseph. He spoke to Moses. He spoke to Elijah. He spoke to David. And their worlds were shaken. by the voice of God, by what He said in their lives. And even under the new covenant, when Jesus came and He spoke, He shook the lives of the disciples, and Mary's life, and Lydia's life, and on, James and Paul. Their lives were shaken to the very core by the voice of God when He spoke to them. And the shaking continues throughout the history as God spoke to Luther and shook him to the core. And God spoke into the life of Cranmer and shook him to the core, and everything changed. And God spoke into the life today of Archbishop Foley Beach and shook his world and called him to form the ACNA. And God spoke into the life of Bishop TJ, the first Anglo or Episcopal priest that came under the oversight of a foreign bishop and started this whole thing. God speaks into the lives of people and He shakes their world. He's spoken into my life and He shook everything. He spoke into Bud's life. He spoke into Bill's life. He shakes everything when He speaks into your life. He changes it all. And He still speaks today. If all you want, frankly, out of Christianity is to become increasingly nice and well-mannered and meet weekly with other nice and well-mannered people to learn how to be nicer and more well-mannered, you've come to the wrong faith. This is not the faith for you. You should find something a lot easier. God will seldom speak into the life of a person and leave you in peaceful tranquility. In fact, it seems that God's purpose is to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted. Over the last 2,000 years, Jesus has been in that business of shaking our lives, of shaking everything that can be shaken. Everything that's temporal, God will shake it. And every person here this morning that's a follower of Jesus, you know that to be the truth. You know that God spoke into your life and He shook everything. Henri Nouwen, a Catholic mystic, in his book Reaching Out, said, "It would be just another illusion to believe that reaching out to God will free you from having trouble," or I would say shaking, in your life. Often indeed, the trouble, the shaking, will take us where we would rather not go. But we know that without going there, we will never find real life. In fact, it's entirely likely that if your life is shaking this morning, that God is speaking into your life. I remember seeing helicopter footage of some damage that was done during Hurricane Andrew back in 1992. And I remember as the newsreel was going, it went over this house and someone had put a banner on the roof of their house and it simply said, "Okay, God, you've got our attention. Now what?" Sometimes when God shakes our world, He is speaking to us. There's something that He wants, and sometimes, quite frankly, God has to hit you between the eyes with a 2x4 just to get your attention. Sometimes God has to shake everything just so that you will say, "Okay, God, you got my attention. Now what?" But most folks are too dense to know that God's speaking into their life, or at least too stubborn. When our lives are shaken, we tend to look for natural causes instead of recognizing God shouting at us through the rubble of our dreams. That's what Jesus meant when He said, "Let him who has ears to hear, hear. Let him who is tuned in to the voice of God hear." You remember when Jesus was baptized in the Jordan with his cousin John. When he came out of the water, the Bible said the voice of God thundered, and most of the people thought it was just thunder when He said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." They didn't recognize the voice of God. They thought it was a natural event. That's how most of us are. If your life is shaking, it might well be that God is speaking into it. It is the voice of God. And we really, in fact, should sit up and pay attention, especially when our lives are being shaken. Because as the author warns us in this passage, there's real danger if we refuse to hear God's voice when He speaks and our world shakes. Verse 25, "See to it that you do not refuse Him who speaks. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, Moses, how much less will we when we turn away from him who warns us from heaven, Jesus. Ignoring God's voice because we don't like the shaking will result in mediocrity. That's what these listeners or these readers were thinking. If I just avoid what God's doing, I can get out of this shaking. I can go back to my normal life. I can abandon it. Remember a few years ago, Holiday Inn had this ad. It said, the best surprise of all is no surprise at all. And it was this idea, the ad was meant to say, most people don't like to be discomforted, and they really like mediocrity. They like things to stay the same. So when you check into a Holiday Inn, you don't have to worry about weird things going on. The best surprise is no surprise at all. It always raised in my mind the question, should life be an adventure, or do we really want to just be comfortable, familiar, and stable? Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, people wish to be settled. Only as far as they are unsettled is there any hope for them. How many of you remember the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, the nuclear disaster? A few people with gray hair raised their hand, myself included. There were 2 electrical engineers in the control room that night. And the best thing that could be said for them is that they were doing unauthorized experiments. They were playing around with a reactor. They were performing what the Soviets later described as unauthorized experimentation. They were trying to see how long a turbine would freewheel when they took the power off of it. Now, taking the power off that kind of a nuclear reactor is a difficult and dangerous thing to do because these reactors are unstable at the lower ranges. And in order to provide in order to power the reactor down, they had to walk through these various stages, and at each stage there was an alarm that went off, and they had to override manually 6 separate computer-driven alarm systems before the disaster could take place. And one by one, the alarms sounded, essentially saying, "Stop, stupid! Don't do this!" And one by one, rather than stopping the experiment, they shut down the alarms and they kept going. And you know the result. Nuclear fallout that was recorded all around the planet. The largest industrial accident ever to occur. In our lives, sometimes this shaking is providing warnings. Something temporal has taken the place of God. Something temporal has gotten in the way. And God begins to shake what can be shaken so that all that remains is what can no longer be shaken. And we ignore God's warnings at our own peril. Entering any kind of relationship with God, I'm just going to tell you, means that God is going to speak and God's going to shake. We can come to God just as we are, wherever we are. God takes us just as we are, but He doesn't leave us just as we are. The shaking that He does, the shaking means that things get removed that are to our detriment. Things get removed that are unstable, actually. Things get removed that are going to fall eventually anyway. Things get removed because God wants us to get to a place that our life is stable with what can no longer be shaken. I was looking in my medicine cabinet that, at this day and age resembles a CVS. I got so many drugs in my medicine cabinet, but there's one bottle of medicine in there that says, "Shake well before using." I think God put that label on each of us. Shake well before we're useful to His kingdom, before God can really put us to any real use. God shakes us for a number of reasons. God shakes us to free us from unnecessary and burdensome things. There's a book called The Living Faith. It was written by a guy named Lloyd Douglas. He tells the story of Thomas Hearne. And Thomas Hearne was an an explorer and journeyed to the mouth of the Coppermine River. And in the diary of Thomas Hearne, it was the day after they had gotten raided by a group of Indians and stole most of their supplies. And in the diary, Thomas Hearne wrote, "The weight of our baggage being so much lightened, our next day's journey was far more pleasant, swift, and easy." Sometimes God just removes things because they get in the way. They trip us up. Corrie ten Boom said, I've learned to hold things in life loosely because when I grasp them, it only hurts more as God pries my fingers away. As God speaks and He shakes, we need to learn to be ready to let go of those things that can be shaken. God not only shakes us for that, He shakes us also to strengthen and purify the unshakable. No shaking seems pleasant at the time it's happening, and yet in God's economy, it is this pain that brings forth new faith. We often hear, I thank God for that hard time in retrospect because it changed my heart, it changed my life, it changed my direction. Even when we may not find the grace to thank God for the pain and the tribulation, we can thank Him for the good that comes out of the pain. Vance Havner in Leadership Magazine said it this way: God uses broken things, in other words, things that have been shaken. God uses broken things, broken soil to produce a crop, broken clouds to give rain, broken grain to give bread, broken bread to give strength. It is the broken alabaster box that gives forth perfume. It is Peter weeping bitterly who returns to greater power, broken. The author begins this 12th chapter by urging his readers in verse 7, endure hardship as discipline. It's training. No discipline, no training seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So when God speaks into our lives, He shakes. It's a dangerous thing to ignore that shaking. It's a dangerous thing to look for natural reasons. When our life is shaken, we need to say, okay, God, you have our attention. Now what? You can have a calm, peaceful life, but you'll never hear God's voice or rise to God's intended purpose for your life. He shakes us so that what remains after the shaking are things that are unshakable. Abraham Herschel, who was a Jewish author, said, faith like Job's cannot be shaken simply because it is the result of having been shaken. And that's what God's looking for in our lives. We long to hear God's voice, but know that when He speaks, everything that is temporal will shake. And God's purpose is to get us to the place where what remains is what we will stand before God with, our character, our transformed lives. God shakes so that is formed and we become unshakable. Let's stand together. Most Holy Father, we thank You so much for Your grace. We stand now before You and ask that the words that come from You, that those seeds would be planted in our heart, and we ask, Father, that they would produce the fruit that You desire. The praise team is going to lead us in a song, and I encourage you to sing along and worship, but if you would like to come and pray at the altar, it's open. Also, there will be prayer ministers over here at the foot of the cross who are there to pray with you about any need in your life. They're discreet, and they've been trained so they can help you reach out to God. And it doesn't matter what the need is. We've seen God do real miracles. After this, we'll move into a time of Holy Communion.